Why do some videos feel more cinematic than others? Well, there's a few factors. There's camera movement, there's camera settings, how you're actually shooting, there is lighting, so how all your lights are positioned, but also your lens choice does matter. So in this video, I wanna dig into anamorphic lenses and why anamorphic lenses feel more cinematic. Now recently I had a client who wanted the cinematic look and specifically requested the anamorphic look. And when I was putting this project together, I was wondering what about the anamorphics made them so much different than some of the other lenses that are available on the market. And because we had a smaller budget on this project, it led me down a rabbit hole to try and figure out how can I get an anamorphic look on the tools that I have access to without renting these big expensive lenses. So there's three things that I want to dive into in this video. First, I want to talk about a brief history of anamorphic lenses and why they became the cinematic look. And then second, I want to talk about the 5 pillars of anamorphic lenses so that you can really understand why they are different than your traditional spherical lens. And once you actually see these 5 things, when you're watching a movie, you're going to realize, oh yeah, that was shot on anamorphic and this is why. And then in the last section, I'm going to talk about how this applies to us. So how can we use what we know about anamorphic lenses to be able to make choices on the gear that we use so that we can get a more cinematic look out of the footage that we're shooting. Now, before we get into this, I just want to show you side by side. Here's 2 different videos that I shot of my daughter. One was on series anamorphic lenses. I have the 24 and the 50, and the other is on my Sony 28 to 135. And I want you to tell me down in the comments if you see any major differences between video A and video B. So what do you think about those 2 looks? So video A was the 28 to 135 spherical lens, and video B was the series anamorphic lenses, and I shot them both on the Sony a7S Mark III. So let's talk about a brief history of anamorphic lenses and why they became the standard for the cinematic look. So back in the 1950s, the motion picture industry needed to find a way to bring people back to the theaters. So this is when anamorphic lenses were adopted to making films because the anamorphic lens shoots a wider field of view and then squishes it onto the piece of film, or now our digital sensors. And the reason that the motion picture industry wanted a wider field of view is that it became an immersive experience. So at home, you're in more of a square format, a 4:3 format, but then you could go to the movie theaters and you get this long stretched out image and it feels like you're there. And so back in the 50s, it was a very immersive experience. And when you paired that with stereo sound, it brought people back to the theaters. And because the image was squished onto a piece of film, you now have these 5 different characteristics that change the look of the image from a typical spherical lens. So the first one, and the one that we see all the time, are lens flares. Anamorphic lenses have more pieces of glass and they have curved pieces of glass, so when light hits the lens, it creates lens flares. Especially when you're shooting directly into your light source, you'll see these different streaks. And the blue lens flare has become like the standard for the cinematic look because of a set of lenses that a lot of movies are made on. Now, the second thing that changes with these lenses is the bokeh, so the space that's out of focus in the background. Any sort of orb that you'd see on a spherical lens, like if you have lights in the background, they're typically circles. But because you're squishing the image, those circles now become ovals. And then also there's what's called the waterfall effect, where the out of focus sections have this painted quality. So the bokeh actually puts more emphasis on what is in focus because the elements that are out of focus are less recognizable and they actually look more blurry and stretched out, so you can't really tell what it is. Now, the third quality of these lenses is there's organic roll-off. Because of this waterfall bokeh, the sections that are in focus to the sections that are out of focus have more of a gradual roll-off, whereas when you're shooting on spherical lenses, especially with the new cameras and new lenses that are coming out, it's very sharp. So Right now, you can see that I'm super sharp and my edges are super clean. I'm shooting on the Sony a7S Mark III on my 35mm at 1.8, and I have a very distinct border around me where it almost looks green screened from the background. And the more out of focus that you have, so if I was shooting at like a 1.2, the more that this effect would be present. But when you're using anamorphic lenses, there's less of the sharpness, which gives it a much more smooth feeling overall. Now, the fourth reason that these lenses are unique is the X to Y axis. So I've been working with the Spherical anamorphic lenses. They have a 1.33 squeeze. And on these lenses, it's like having a 50mm top to bottom and a 35 side to side. And let me show you what I mean by that. Now, this is shot on a 35mm spherical lens. Now, to get the same background perspective, take a look at the fish on the left and the tree on the right, you have to shoot on a 50mm anamorphic lens. And when you de-squeeze the anamorphic, you get that image of a 35 side to side, but a 50mm top to bottom. It's a different style of perspective and distortion in the background. And this is definitely much more present on a 2x anamorphic. Now, the fifth pillar of anamorphic lenses is how the rack focus works. Because you're squeezing the image, when you rack focus from the foreground to the background, there's actually a stretching effect that happens on the image and it almost feels like it's moving without actually physically moving the camera. And the big thing with anamorphic lenses is overall, the image just feels more organic and less clinical. When you're shooting on anamorphics, it's just not as clean. There's more distortion, there's more chromatic abrasion. When you move to the edges of frame, it's just not as clean. And then you have all of these factors that look different than spherical lenses. The only reason that we think this looks more cinematic than the spherical lenses that we're using now is because we've seen it in the movies. We've grown up watching all these big blockbuster films shot on anamorphic lenses, and that look has been ingrained in us, and when we see it, it makes us feel like it's more of a film rather than a video. So how can all of this apply to us and the content that we're creating? Because one of the big issues when it comes to anamorphic lenses is that they're expensive. They're big, they're heavy, they're a lot of glass, and they're just not accessible to most productions. But there are a lot of ways as creators that we can emulate these looks if we want more of that filmic style. So the big one is flares. There's filters that we can use that we can add on front that will add additional flares into our image. Now, also the organic roll-off and the kind of blooming effect that you'll see on anamorphics, we can use diffusion filters and it's gonna make our lenses look less clean. So this sample here is with my Cinebloom 10%, and you can see how the lights have a blooming effect. Diffusion filters work great, and I've been buying a lot of different styles of diffusion filters to figure out which ones I like the best when I'm out shooting. Recently, I've been using the Cinebloom 10% from Moment, but as I get more of these filters and start playing around with them, I'm gonna do some more videos where I really dig into diffusion filters and kind of the different looks that you can achieve using them. Now, another thing that you can do is use vintage lenses. Older lenses are just not as clean. They have more imperfections. And those imperfections actually will make an image a lot of times feel more cinematic. And the other thing that I've been playing around with are the cheaper anamorphics that are available. So I have the Siri 24mm and the 50mm, which are made for APS-C cameras, but on my Sony a7S Mark III, I can use that clear image zoom, and you can actually shoot anamorphic on this camera. When I was shooting this project with my client, I was using these 1.33 squeeze lenses paired with a Cinebloom 10% and an ND filter, and I was able to get some really cool looks and some cool lens flares, and it just had this much more organic quality to it rather than that super clean look that I typically get when I'm shooting with my lenses. Now, like I said at the beginning of this video, it's not just one thing that makes your footage feel more cinematic. So next, I highly suggest you check out this video here. It dives into some other reasons why some videos feel more cinematic than others. I'll see you over there.